everyone, welcome to Cuberviews, episode 46. This is your host, Ian Braverman. I hope you're having a really nice day. Today, I'm joined by Derek Gallen. How's it going?
Hello, Ian. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I saw you again at Boston Cube Party, and I was like, oh, would you want to come on the show? And you were telling me like, I'm not really doing as much Cube these days. And then you came back to me with like, I got an idea, something we have to talk about. We got to get this to the public. And I was like, all right, I'll do it for you, Derek.
I appreciate your donation to the cause. Thank you.
And how's it going today?
Today's okay. Rainy day today and a little sleep deprived, but I had my second cup of coffee, so I'm ready.
Cube will wake you right up.
He will wake me right up. Absolutely. Yeah.
Of course. And yeah, we played a few times, like at MagicCon Philadelphia. You played a very early version of my Proliferate cube. And that cube, I will say, was not my best cube that I've put in front of people before. I don't know if you remember that.
I think so. Yeah.
After like the first round, it was like, yeah, I don't think this is working too.
Yeah, I think I like played one round and then dropped from it and like went and drafted or did something else. Yeah.
I don't blame you. The decks were pretty a mess. That was like the first time I put it in front of people. So
That's okay. Those kinds of things can be very valuable, if people are like down for that kind of stuff.
yeah. And you're also the designer of the Cube 4 packs of Magic, which has been at CubeCon and which I had the chance to play. And it was really fun. A cube where each player drafts 4 packs and it's like very constructed-esque, very powerful decks. I would say it's one of the more complicated cubes I've played. Very fun cube, though.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. That was like probably like the summation of a lot of my efforts years ago to create an environment that leaned pretty hard into constructed ideas, both from like a rate standpoint, mana fixing standpoint, playing 2 copies of a lot of cards. Oh my God, 4 packs. Can you imagine? Who would want to draw 4 packs anymore in this economy?
We got to draft 2 packs. You got to keep
Yeah,
lowering it.
absolutely. Now we're doing 2 picks per pack, 4 players, swinging in the other direction.
I think that cube probably inspired a lot of people. I've seen like my friend has his Doubleton Synergy cube and a lot of cubes that I've been seeing that like have like a lot of duplicates. That cube is a pioneer a little bit.
I like to think it had an impact, yeah. There was something about like going to an extreme with regards to mana fixing, just playing multiple copies of a lot of cards in the cube to incentivize like building around specific strategies. And I'm sure that's pretty commonplace now with the way people build cubes, but like all the way back then in 2022, it was so new, so fresh, you know?
And that cube was very competitive. It was a very like high power, strong cube, but now you're a filthy casual commander player. Tell me about that.
Well, I am a washed up ex-competitive player. And so I am embracing Commander. It is the format I play the most in right now. Just some broad strokes. I really enjoy deck building Commander. I think it's incredibly complex. You can really lose time in the weeds in a Commander deck, both from like an optimization standpoint as well as like building towards different things like resilience or backup plans and stuff. There's a lot of space to find joy in Commander. My play group is awesome. I'm actually going to see them later today after we're done recording this. So I'm going to go play Commander all day after this. So I got to get my cube in the morning.
You haven't convinced this commander group to play cube with you yet?
We all played Cube for years. All of us are like played either at a competitive level or as game designers like in the past. These guys are all like hardcore limited players specifically and have seen a lot of success in like tournament Magic, professional Magic. And so they're a pretty hardcore group of guys. I enjoy the intensity that we all bring to the table
Yes.
with such a casual format, you know. We're not all playing like Ristic Studies and Soul Rings and stuff. We're playing like kind of janky stuff, but I found, I was saying this to you before we started recording, there's a lot about Commander that becomes so wonderful once you have like a really dialed in regular group. It's been the thing that's kind of anchored me to the format.
Yeah, you just got to play a winter orb on turn 2.
That's right. Every game. Yeah. Winter Orb, Static Orb, Propaganda, Stasis, Armageddon. Yeah. We're all making friends out here.
And I just want to say, I've been saying it every week. ConnectiCube is going to be happening February 14th and 15th outside of Hartford next year, 2026. It's a 64-person cube event. The Discord link will be in the description. So everyone come join us if you can make it. I hope you can make it, Derek.
Hope I can make it too. I have the weekend earmarked. It is Valentine's Day. Is going to cause a little bit of negotiation at my house, but it's not that far of a drive. I'm not that far from Hartford, and I do miss going to Connecticut. I did grow up there, as you know, so it could be nice to go for that reason too.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me a little bit about your history with Magic and Cube. I know you were a very competitive player before, but
Mhm.
tell me about how you got into Magic, your competitive history, and how you found Cube.
Sure. So I started playing Magic in 1994. I started playing with revised starter decks. Obviously fell in love with the game pretty fast. I cast a Sarah Angel in my first game of Magic, and that was it. I was hooked.
There's
Um,
nothing better.
there's literally nothing better. I played a lot in the 90s. I played a lot of PTQs, played a lot locally. I went to the JSS in 1999 at Pro Tour New York. I got into college. I went to art school. So naturally, I thought, that was it. I'm going to be an artist now. I'm not going to play this card game anymore. Ridiculous. I'm going to go think about life and death, and I'm
It's
going
a
to
children's card game.
yeah, it's a children's card game. It's like, yeah. So I sold all my cards, didn't think about Magic for about 10 years. And then I came back to it. I was unemployed for the first time in my life. I was like a, working adult and suddenly remembered Magic one day. Started playing again. This was probably 2012, 2013. Fell into an LGS scene, started playing constructed and limited, and started going to Grand Prix back in the golden age of Grand Prix Magic. And I work on weekends. I wasn't like always free to go to all of them, but I went to, 4 or 5 a year or so for a long time. I was also part of Team Draft League in New York City. This was a competitive team draft seasonal tournament that we would do in New York. Had about 30 to 40 people at any given time. Always retail booster draft, 3v3, winner takes all, money in the pot. Did that for years, probably
Was
from
that with like
original.
Ryan Sachs and Zach Barish?
Zach Barish, but Ryan came on later. But Zach was part of the kind of initial group, but Ryan was part of it for a little bit. I think we played from Theros to Ikoria. So we managed
Ooh.
to get one season in during the pandemic, but then it kind of fell apart after Ikoria. Hard to manage. A lot of people having somebody kind of like run that is really complicated. But so anyway, played a lot of Modern and Legacy, a lot of Limited. Went to a lot of Grand Prix. Day two cashed. I think my last Grand Prix was in 2020. There Was Beyond Death. Sold everything right around the time of the pandemic. Like all my modern cards, all my legacy cards. Went head on into Cube. I've been into Cube probably since 2013, since I came back to the game, but I didn't really like dive headfirst into it until probably like just before the pandemic. I'd like to say I've been designing cubes for 11 years, but it's more like 5 or 6, like when I was really passionate about it, I guess.
Very cool. And what was your favorite legacy or modern deck?
Delver in Legacy. Delver won me a lot of money. I refused to play Legacy without Brainstorm and Force of Will. And Modern, it was by far and away, it was Jund. Just classic Boomer Jund. Heavy, heavy attrition battles, Liliana the Veil. Like, that was my pride and joy. I used to carry, the Jund deck with me to tournaments. I used to carry the Jund extra pile of Jund cards. So you could like make changes to your Jund deck, like whatever you were feeling, like your one Corsair Crew Fix, your one Jund Charm, just trying to feel out what you want to play that day. It's a Jund lifestyle.
I think I remember Delver being pretty powerful in four packs of Magic, actually.
Yeah, definitely. When you want Delver to be good, it requires a lot of support, but when Delver is good, it's some people really have fun with that.
And you have a pretty cool job. I remember you telling me that you were touring the WotC headquarters.
It has nothing to do with my job.
Oh,
I have friends that work at WotC, so yes, I went into WotC headquarters a couple of years ago. But my job is I work for Chrome Hearts. Chrome Hearts is a manufacturer of silver jewelry and clothing, furniture and home, lifestyle. Everything is made in America. All our factory, all our production, it's all in Los Angeles. Been in business since 1988. and I do client development for them. So I'm a very front-facing person. I interface with very high-level people every day, all day. My social battery kind of like goes through pretty big swings, throughout my work week. Very demanding job in that regard. I also do a lot of back-end stuff with product allocation and roadmap and feedback and all this stuff to just try to like build our client base as the company continues to grow because it's probably the hottest brand in the world and has been for a while in like the clothing, fashion, like luxury sphere. Yeah, I'm even getting exhausted just thinking about it. My job
Well,
is
we won't
really
exhaust you too much before we get into Cube.
my job can be really intense. So I'm like just like coming off a work week now, just thinking about my job, and I'm like, oh my God. It's yeah. Yeah, I'm a very like kind of extroverted front-facing person, so that's a lot of load bearing what I do.
And today we're talking about how chaos reigns. And there's a quote here that you gave me for Anthony Bourdain that says, I'm a big believer in winging it. I'm a big believer that you're never going to find the perfect city travel experience or the perfect meal without a constant willingness to experience a bad one. Letting the happy accident happen is what a lot of vacation itineraries miss, I think. And I'm always trying to push people to allow those things to happen rather than to stick to some rigid itinerary. Tell me about what we're talking about today.
Well, clearly we're talking about magic, which means we're talking about food, right? That's the joke.
Oh, yeah.
Um, if this Anthony Bourdain quote didn't kind of create some kind of suggestion here in my title there, Chaos Reigns, I want to talk about embracing larger cube sizes as it's been a big part of my evolution as somebody interested in cube design. I guess to give you a brief overview, I, like so many other people, loved the idea of drafting an entire cube every time I played with it for a number of reasons. I was a pretty big champion of that for a while. I have since flipped that completely on its head and now only love drafting, in this example, 540 card cubes. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between these experiences from the perspective of somebody who has learned to really embrace the variance of a larger cube and has learned how to design with that in mind in a way that helps like kind of maximize the experience.
Yeah, 540, 360, anywhere in between, more. I think it's a really interesting question about what you're looking for your play group and what you're looking for your cube design to fit what goal you're looking for. Like I've
Mhm.
built many different cube sizes. I've built 500, 540, 360, 180. I often just have like a 420 or a 415 to add a little bit of variance and throw in like a booster tutor or something. And it all depends on what the project is, I think. Like, for example, if you want something like we're going to be talking about later on, that's really a tight list that has to be really specific. Like, if you're trying to build a cube that is all based around a rules change or something, or a very specific interaction, compared to a 540 that it brings a lot more variance to the cube. It brings a lot more skill we're going to be talking about, which I think is really interesting. So I'm excited to jump into that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of go through this with you. It's something I think a lot about.
So tell me about what you think the differences between a 540 and a 360 is inherently. Like, how does it affect the draft experience for players?
Sure. So for the sake of the conversation, let's assume that 360 means we're drafting the entire cube and
Yeah.
540 means we're not drafting the entire cube. And you can, for the sake of the listener, they can assume 450, 540, 720, whatever. Like just that there is going to be cube left over at the end of the draft. There's differences both from the perspective of the designer, the person putting it together, like the kind of skill that's necessary to make the cube coherent in its communication. And then there's skill that the drafter has to bring to the table in order to navigate it successfully. This isn't to say that drafting an entire cube is less of a skillful exercise from either point. But as somebody who used to design these like very contained experiences, there were some goals that I believed in back then that I've called into question. And the ones that I've listed out here for you are this idea of control, predictability, and skill expression that designers will associate with their lists. That the output of a smaller cube creates these circumstances like control or predictability. And I think that that's not true, but it took me a long time to understand how I could express these things in a larger cube. That a larger cube will present itself different challenges, but ultimately, I believe more opportunities to express yourself as a designer, and that you will give your players more opportunities to be challenged. Now, I'm speaking as somebody who is inherently a competitive person, and I assume that not everybody that is interested in Cube is like a competitive person and how they engage with Magic, but for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that people are interested in some way of like there being some kind of like emphasis on somebody winning a game, winning a match, winning a draft. Before I get into sort of the elements of a smaller cube, a 360 card cube, there's a pretty big perspective shift when you need to increase a cube size because you're essentially learning how to balance a high amount of variability in the outcome of the card pool that's drafted. Things like emergent design that come to mind that people talk a lot about in cube design spaces, as well as a wider variation of like actual experiences game to game, but also like just a wider breadth of synergistic implications of the interactions between every single card in the cube. And most importantly, I would say the fight against negentropy or negentropy. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but negentropy is actually the reason that I reached out to you about talking about this. So for those of you who don't know what negentropy is, which I'm assuming is most of you, because I didn't know what it was. So negentropy is the force that a player puts on the game of Magic, or actually any game. So the theory behind negentropy is that a player is going to try to solve a game whenever they engage with it. And that is not necessarily saying that they're going to try to like present the solution of how to play the game optimally, but just that they're going to try to organize the information that's presented to them in some way to some end state. And that end state is often like identified as they've solved it in some way. So there's this idea of negentropy as trying to create order, the opposite of entropy, which is to create disorder or to create chaos. I believe that the tension that we often experience as designers with our players is this exact tension of entropy and negentropy. We're trying to create disorder. We're trying to present information or cards in a closed system to the players, and they're going to try and organize it into order or into a solved state. I believe that as a designer, I should make this process for the player both as difficult as possible, but also as rewarding as possible. And then the cube should, in some ways, endure this process so that the solvability of your game, the ease at which this is possible for the player, is difficult. I don't know how else to say it. It should not be easy to bring your cube into a solved state. But the challenge is how do I make that hard for the player while also making it incredibly enjoyable as an experience? What do you think about that? I'm
I
so
think that's a
curious.
really interesting perspective. I feel like I've designed cubes that are on either side of the spectrum there, I would say. Like, I've seen a really big push in the cube community, I would say recently, for cubes that are more new player friendly and cubes that might, in some ways, be a little bit more solvable, like cubes that have more basic interactions, cubes that have less combo or less deep archetypes and more surface level archetypes. So those kind of cubes, especially in the 360, might get solved a little bit faster compared to other cubes that I've played. For example, I would even say the four packs of Magic, where it's such a larger pool that you draft, four packs. It can become really difficult to decide which cards to put into your deck because you get so many cards at the end, more than 45. There's a lot of different paths you could take. Different cubes definitely have a higher or lower skill ceiling, I would say, for players while navigating the draft. And cube size, I think, has a effect on that too. If it's a 360 when you can see every card in the cube, then you can plan for things more. Like when I had Ryan Sachs on and he was talking about that you kind of have to look at the whole list as being potentially a part of your draft pool.
Mhm.
When it's a 360, you're going to see everything compared to a 540. it branches off so much more. It's so much harder to tell what you're going to see. And it just adds to that complexity. I think it also comes down to who you're building your cube for. If you're building a cube for, I would say, a more competitive group, like the group that you're playing with, or a newer group of players, but that's something we're also going to get into, which I think is really interesting, is not underestimating your players. And players like to be challenged.
They do. They do more than we assume that they do. I've heard a lot about this emphasis on new players and lowering complexity and like a softer way to get into cube drafting because cube drafting is really complicated and it's a hard way to play the game. But I would actually push back on that a little bit and say that I play a lot of Commander now. And Commander's unbelievably complex as a format. The amount of information that you have to take in, the amount of like possibilities that happen each game. I think that players are a lot more tolerant of complexity than we give them credit for, especially in 2025. I look at the success of games like Slay the Spire or Elden Ring, that games that are supposed to be intensely hard and high complexity and with such a wide band of gameplay possibilities and the success of them. I think about like that against like somebody saying that Cube is hard and we have to make it easy for the player. I think I just disagree fundamentally. We can push people harder as players. I think that they all secretly like it. And I think that as a designer, it falls on you to make that possibility of failure with higher complexity fun. We are ostensibly people that make games out of magic cards. And I think that if we're trying to be successful, I think trying to give people a fun experience as we define it is like a mandate. I don't care how easy or hard your cube is. If we're all not enjoying ourselves, then what's the point?
Yeah, I like to
Um,
say that I think that Commander is just an insane way that we get into so many new players into Magic. It's just such a complex format. There's so
yeah,
much going on at once. And when new players say, "Oh, I'm afraid to play Cube for the first time," I'm thinking in the back of my head, like in Commander, like every game you're seeing like 300 cards you've probably never seen before. So
yeah. The information complexity, there's board state complexity, just synergistic complexity. Like people can build these machines, these Rube Goldberg machines, or these like, value engines that are so fidgety and with so much material. It's so shocking to me that new players can play Commander so competently, and I'm glad that you kind of agree with me on that.
So another topic that I was really interested in that you wrote here in the outline is when does it make sense to be a 540 versus a 360?
Hmm.
I think that's a really interesting question because I see many cubes that are 540, like vintage cubes, that still include something like Storm.
Hmm.
And Storm, when it's in a 540, has such a higher potential fail rate than a 360. Storm has pieces that are just required for it to function, or it becomes so much more difficult, especially in like a vintage cube that's such high power. Like if you don't see an underworld breach or you don't see an LED, if you don't see the Storm actual payoff, it's so hard for that deck to come together. But a lot of 540s include something like Storm. And for example, I was playing a vintage cube a few months ago, and there was one player who's been on the podcast once before, Brian, and we drafted vintage cube at my game store that I go to every week, Games IRL in Avon, Connecticut. And he did not get a Storm payoff, but instead he got Dark Depths combo. And this just like opened my eyes to players like to be challenged. They like to have to make a flexible and in the moment decision that can have a deck that's really creative and still be very powerful.
Self-expression is a huge part of the game. And I think like giving people more opportunities to do that is, I think, very valuable. I want to dig into the Storm thing because it's such a great representation of where I want to point this conversation towards with regards to how do we balance a larger cube to withstand something like Storm, right? The card Tendrils of Agony, right? Let's just use as an example. How do you justify Tendrils of Agony in a cube that you might not draft it? And there's a couple ways that you can go about this as a designer that will kind of reinforce Storm, right? So you can do it through redundant paths. Like you can play additional copies of Tendrils of Agony. You can play other Storm win conditions. So you could play Empty the Warrens or Brain Freeze or whatever. And that's like where a lot of like level one design comes in, where we talk about redundant payoffs for something like Storm so that the drafter can find a different way to victory. The path that I've sort of embraced as an alternative, well, maybe not as an alternative, but as like a layer on top of a redundancy, is to create more paths to and from cards like Tendrils of Agony. What do I mean by this? When you're asking people to like play with storm cards, you're asking them to like cast a lot of spells in a single turn, but also with specifically with tendrils, the way you're going to win is to drain. So what if I gave you the card Sorin of House Markov? What if I gave you that card and I said this card was an opportunity to play this is a storm card, and that a card like this would allow you to bridge both drain effects more in your cube as well as give you a shorter tendrils kill. It'll also be a creature that can attack and block. You can create paths to different cards like Tendrils of Agony through creatures and through other means.
I think that's really interesting. Having archetypes that can kind of branch off in a 540 and just kind of embracing that not every archetype may show up in every draft. Like, for example, like you were saying, the Tendrils of Agony can be a life and drain card with something like the MH3 Sorin. Even if the storm pieces do not come together to build a storm deck, if the actual pieces that are useful in the storm deck can be used to flesh out another archetype, like a drain deck with Sorin or something, then I think it can create really emergent design because if the drafters don't see the storm payoffs, but this can push them in a new direction, like when my friend built his weird storm dark depths combo deck, I think that can create really interesting emergent design like we were talking about.
Yeah, it requires a framing of card evaluation that relies on this principle that I'm working on called maximalism, where you're trying to identify as many potential pathways as possible between all the cards in your cube. And this like perspective on card evaluation is less reliant on the notion of archetypes and more reliant on like trying to identify what the centers of power in your cube are and how to create links between all of them. There's this great visual that I have of whenever you build the deck, you should be able to draw a line from the first card in your draft pool to the last one and try to create a connection between everything. Every card can feasibly find some relationship with any other card. It's not possible, practically speaking, but it's an ideal that you can aspire to. And the more you look at cards through the lens of creating different networks of synergy, the more that you can build towards this maximalist framework. You can find a way to create resilience in all the different space that your cube occupies through these relationships from like an individual level all the way to a deck, to a draft pool, the entire cube itself. This is an important distinction between this sort of maximalism framework and this archetype framework. As you put it, the Storm deck didn't come together, but the Dark Depths combo was in the draft pool, so they were able to just win a different way. Maybe they had some tutors, maybe they had some ways to filter, to mill, and like create some consistency through the card pool. I'm sort of talking more expansively about trying to find a relationship between more and more and more cards, such that the cube, in theory, can endure any card in it not being drafted. And that is one of the main points of distinction that I make between this larger cube size preference and someone who is very passionate about drafting an entire list every time. Like I said in the beginning, there's this wish for control, there's a wish for predictability, and those things are not inherent to a 360, but they're like the desired outcome of a 360. But if you release this idea of control and release this idea of predictability and instead embrace the variance, you can find more relationships between your cards than just trying to pave a bunch of different runways of archetypes through a cube.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective about archetypes. When you really go for an archetype design forward thinking, I think that really makes a lot of sense in a 360 or a smaller cube because every card will be seen. So those archetypes can really shine, even if an individual drafter doesn't get all the pieces for an archetype, but they can at least know that they were all there compared to this maximalist design, where I think that's something that I was talking with similarly with Ryan Sachs, having a lot of glue pieces and then build arounds and allowing players to, based off of what they are currently seeing, react instead of having to build towards specific archetypes. Instead, build something creative based off what they're seeing in the packs.
Yeah, it's not what deck am I in, it's what can I do with the cards that are in front of me. And that is inherently a more creative space to occupy. At least I believe it is. It requires a kind of skill, the creative skill in deck building that can be very challenging for some players. Admittedly, this path does lead me to places where I find that people that are just better deck builders overall have more success when I put this kind of cube in front of them because they can think more freely about associations. Whereas, like a smaller cube, it can be very straightforward what's being asked of you. Now, like as you were suggesting just now, like talk a little bit about when does the 360 actually make sense?
Yeah.
I did come up with some suggestions. A lot of times these come down to like when you try to shrink the design space of Magic down to something like I'm going to make a blue artifacts cube or I'm going to make a emblem cube like the companion
Cascade
cube
cube.
or the cascade cube are like great examples of this. I'm going to modify the rules of the game such that I'm going to radically change your card evaluation as you go into the draft. I'm going to front load you with all that information so that your complexity budget as a player is spent trying to sift through what's being given to you, given this special rule or this whittling down of the game into a very specific lens. Oftentimes, there's not enough design space to fill a larger cube, and the communication for the cube to be successful has to be smaller. Like 100 ornithopters is another example of like where this is perfect. It has to be this tight experience. I also think like portability is a really big deal. Smaller cubes are easier to carry around. This is not something that's trivial.
Yeah.
I spoke with somebody in Boston, the Cube Party, about a desert cube because I don't like desert cubes, and I drafted a desert cube of theirs. I asked them, why bother drafting basic lands? Like, what's the benefit here? Because it didn't make my draft any more interesting. It didn't present me with any unique situations. And we went kind of back and forth for a little bit, and I was really pressing them to give me an answer that it made sense to me. And as soon as they said it's easier to clean up and carry around and, get ready to draft, I was like, that's all I need to know. Because that is a really, really good reason to have a smaller cube, or to, in this instance, to draft a desert cube, because you don't need to organize a land box. You don't need any of that stuff. So that's another reason a smaller cube makes sense. I guess my bar cube is another example of that too. Portability was one of the biggest design challenges of that cube, so it had to be small. I think there are really good reasons for small cubes. This is not me saying every cube needs to be big. Every cube needs to have variance. Every cube needs to kind of embrace these philosophies that I've been loving working on lately. I do think that there's a myth about larger cubes that they go off the rails because of variance. So there can be things like non-games and stuff. I've never found that to be true once I started really dabbling in the space. So I think that larger cubes, 540 card cubes, are superior for my design goals right now. I guess I'm here trying to sell everyone on the idea of trying to balance variance as cube designers. I think it's a really hard challenge, a really interesting one.
Back to what we were talking about before with navigating the draft, it's so interesting that when I talk to players, I feel like some people have different mindsets when they're going into the draft. Like some players will ask you, so what are the archetypes?
Mm-hmm.
What are like the decks I can play? Okay, there's an artifact deck, there's a madness deck, there's a control deck. Sounds good. I know what I need to do. And then there are other players who say, I don't want to know anything about this cube, or let me just look at the list. Okay, I know what's in here. Sounds good. They just almost ignore the designer's opinions
Mm-hmm.
about here are the decks that I intended to put in.
Mm-hmm.
And those are both totally fine perspectives to go into a draft. But I think that the ignore the designer perspective kind of way, that I don't know, that's a good way to say it, or kind of wing it more, is a very skill testing way to play. You have to be able to be much more go with the flow. You have to be able to really evaluate what you've already taken and what you're seeing in the packs and go pack by pack. And I find that hard. I'm very impressed by people who can do that. And I think that people who can do that often build really powerful decks and do really well. And I think that 540, with it having more variance and having to see what's being in the packs in the moment, because you can't always know that certain cards are going to be there, is a great way to practice that type of drafting.
It is. There is a level of tension involved that's really exciting and that you have to kind of ride. I can't tell you how many times I've been a blue-white player in a small cube and I can just wheel my Teferi Hero of Dominaria. And those kinds of experiences, I'm using a very reductive example, but those kinds of experiences are really boring to me just because you can almost divide a cube like that into 8 different piles and have everybody kind of just be given the archetypes that were in the cube already. I want to be stressed. I want it to be confusing. I want it to be tense. I want to know as little as possible as to what the next pack's going to bring me. And then I want to be able to put those things together for myself. Your example of ignoring the designer's goals instead of being told what the goals are is really interesting. The people that ask, they're the players that want to play along with you. They're the players that want to jump on your train and buy the ticket and take the ride. The people that don't ask, it's either because they enjoy the experience of trying to figure it out for themselves, or they just don't believe you in the first place and they're going to push back on everything that you've created and they're going to try to break down your game. Those people are very valuable as players because they'll often find any reason they can to exploit the things that you've put in there that shouldn't be in there or that are dominant in an environment. Like the poster child of this being Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I've had endless conversations about this card because it's not a synergy card, it's not a graveyard card, it's not a discard card, it's not a token card, it's not an enchantment card, it's not any of those cards. It's just really, really strong on rate. The amount of times somebody will tell you that they have these kinds of synergies in their cube and then they have Fable, it doesn't matter what you put with that card. It's too overwhelming of a singular card. And players that don't believe you will look for any reason they can to find Fables of the Mirror Breakers in your cube. They're valuable as stress testers, those players, because they'll show you everything that you have that's like can go wrong with your vision of your cube. But they'll also show you that your cube vision isn't fully fleshed out yet because you don't actually know what you're doing and that these things are going to show up.
I think
I
Fable
find,
of the Mirror Breaker is a really interesting card in when it comes to our discussion about 540 and navigating the draft, because in some ways it's almost the perfect card for creating emergent synergy because it can do so many things and it can become the glue for so many decks. Like
Mhm.
if you decide, oh, I am going to go toward a more discard related strategy, then the discard part of Fable and the Mirror Breaker becomes super important to you. Or if you are going to be a more artifact deck, then the token that it makes becomes really powerful. And cards like that in a 540, where you kind of have to navigate based off what's happening in the draft, cards that can do a lot of different things. Maybe Fable is just a little bit too strong that it just becomes good on its own, no matter what it's doing. But cards like that, I feel like let you branch off into different directions and be creative.
Yes, I agree with you insofar as like the card creates a lot of material and moves a lot of pieces around. I don't enjoy calling that stuff synergy anymore because there's so much quote unquote synergy drilled into so many cards in Magic now that like the wrong way to look at Fable is as a synergy card. The wrong way to view discard, madness, graveyard, token creation, like to view that these are synergistic mechanically. This is just kind of more where Magic is at right now. I think like synergy is inherent to cards more than they've ever been. So while you're pointing out opportunities to exploit a card like Fable of the Mirror Breaker in this instance, this is just kind of like what we can do with our cards now. I think synergy has a lot of negative connotations or like dumbed down connotations in the designer's eyes or maybe even in players' eyes too. That synergy is somehow less powerful than power, and that these two things are like fundamentally and diametrically opposed to each other. I think that they're way too intertwined now. So the reason Fable is strong is not just because of the mana value, like with the rate, the output versus the input of the card, But because of all the things that it does, like all of the ways it manipulates resources and moves cards between zones, these are just powerful mechanical expressions now that cards are just doing more and more in Magic. For me, calling that stuff synergy, I think synergy is like a dirty word. Maybe that's just me.
I can totally see that. And so you've been working a lot on this Cogwork Combo Cube, which is a 540.
Mhm.
Could you tell us about how these perspectives and what you've learned about 540 and embracing variance and respecting your players, some tangible insights into how that has affected this cube's design?
Hmm. So the cube was brought about because I wanted to really sink my teeth into designing towards this goal of maximalism to try to better define this concept for myself and to give players a chance to express this deck building philosophy. I was really inspired by my time engaged with Slay the Spire. If anybody has not played that game yet, the quick way I'll define it. I don't know if you've played it, Ian.
I haven't actually played it. I
Okay.
keep meaning to.
As somebody that likes to design cubes, I would strongly suggest that you give it a try. The core conceit of Slay the Spire is that it's like a deck building game. The core kind of interplay of the game is that you're just attacking and blocking across this roguelike experience, like with rooms and enemies that grow in power, and you're constantly adding cards to your deck. And there's so much combo potential and so much synergy that's inherent in each of the heroes and your card pool. You can often build these like crazy storm decks and crazy combo decks through the course of the game of each of your runs. So you have this wild ceiling for the game each time you do a run, but every game is still about combat and attacking and blocking. And I find that balance to be very stimulating. And one of the reasons I continue to work on this cube is trying to find better that balance between every deck being a deck that relies on creatures and creature combat, and every deck also having the potential to do something ridiculous, all the way up to storm combo kills. There was a quote I had, every deck is some form of 2-drop, 3-drop, question mark, combo kill you, which is like to suggest that every deck can curve out and put normal pressure on you from like just a creature combat scenario. And then everybody has this like explosive, wildly swingy effect that they can do in their deck if they choose to embrace all of that. I'm really interested in like the sort of fluidity that comes along with thinking that way. You're trying to blend macro archetypes together, like the sort of Chapin wheel of macro archetypes. I like to think that every deck is kind of aggro, control, combo, and mid-range at the same time. One of the concepts in the cube is using centers of power as a core like balancing knob for the cube instead of using archetypes and things that point towards specific archetypes. Centers of power is a working theory that I have about individual cards being a center of power. There's a couple of examples I can give you here, like Phyrexian Dreadnought is a great example of a center of power. Fable the Mirror Breaker is a center of power. Cards that like allow you to build towards them and outward from them. They're like your central nodes in your cube. So I'm not asking you to build around mono red aggro or green ramp or blue control. I'm asking you to build around individual cards and an individual subset of cards that the cube then supports around itself. There's cards that are centers of power, and then there's game actions as centers of power. This cube also views things like manipulating the top of your library as a center of power. Cards like Brain Surge, Brainstorm, and Jace the Mind Sculptor are not just ways for you to create card filtering, but also can set up the top of your deck for a miracle. So the game action itself is the focal point of a deck or the focal point of your strategy. And there's a bunch of different expressions of these actions as centers of power. So you have this relationship between the cards and the game actions that interweave together to create value and to create combos. And that's kind of the way I define combos in the cube. I'm not playing Splinter Twin. I'm not playing Sneak Attack. I think the only A plus B combo in the cube is Walking Ballista and Heliod. But generally speaking, it's more of this relationship between different power centers in the cube and trying to view the sort of network that the cube is, like the network of cards, as the relationship between these actions and these cards.
I
In
mean, that
my
really is really interesting because it like draws back to what we were talking about before. Instead of going by archetype when you're the drafter, going by what you're seeing in the pack and then building around it. So, like, for example, if you see the Phyrexian Dreadnought, that can completely push you into a whole new different direction. It might not specifically be an archetype, but it shapes your draft decisions.
Yes, Phyrexian Dreadnought is probably the best example in the cube. Most people will see it and they'll think to themselves, there's got to be a stifle in here. And there are a couple of stifles in there. There's like Tail's End and Galadriel's Dismissal. And that's like pretty level one stuff, right? Like you get your stifle knot interaction together, right? It's like a little puzzle piece. But in order to further support this as a power center, you have to look at it as a set of stats that can be manipulated to different ends. That's why cards like Terror of the Peaks exist in the cube. That's why Greater Good exists in the cube or Altar of Dementia. These are different ways to express the rate that you get from Dreadnought in a way that can do something extremely powerful. Terror of the Peaks is 1 mana for 12 damage. Greater Good is 1 mana for 12 cards. And Altar of Dementia is 1 mana to mill somebody 12 cards. It is a center of power that you can then build around in a myriad of ways. You can have all of these cards together in the same deck, or you can just play towards one of them and the deck can lean another direction. You could take Scroll of Fate and you can manifest the Dreadnought from your hand and then you can blink it with Ephemerate and have your surprise 12/12 on the battlefield. To me, in my definition, these are all combos in the cube. And your goal as a drafter is to try to navigate all this stuff together and to build something that can be multifaceted, resilient, and to be able to, pop off the way that these things can do sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting way to design cubes that I've been trying to do more, but I feel like I still end up in the archetype design. And it's complicated to design a cube like that. It can be very rewarding, like you said, for the designer and the players.
I mean, I like to think so, obviously. Um, I think it just tests like a different set of skills. I think that like identifying archetypes, identifying wheels, and like building towards like the best form of a traditional archetype is a skill. And I think like the base game of like sequencing plays and playing around with the opponent's doing and like that kind of stuff, there's a lot of fruit to be had in those experiences. I'm just trying to add this layer of mastery to both the draft, the deck building, and the gameplay that is going to embrace all of like the variance that comes around with all these different effects happening at the same time. The creativity that you can use to build these kinds of decks and the sort of balancing knob, like I keep coming back to with creatures, so that we're not playing like kind of dirtle combo magic. We're still using creatures to anchor all the decks.
Yeah.
These are just like stressing different kinds of drafter skills. And it's much more in the moment. It's much more improvisational. It's more stimulating to me as a designer and plays to some of my strengths as a player. Yeah.
And I want to say before we get into the wrap up here, I like this last quote that we have here. I've long believed that good food, good eating is all about risk. Whether we're talking about unpasteurized Stilton, raw oysters, or working for organized crime associates, food for me has always been an adventure. And I think that is a really interesting way to sum up kind of what we've been talking about, that the draft is an adventure. And the more you can have your drafter experience that adventure and kind of be taken down different paths by different cards, these centers of power or these build arounds, not be as on rails feeling, which sometimes maybe a 360 can make that feel that way compared to a 540 with the variance. It's a really great way to build a cube.
I mean, you keep throwing all these greatness and compliments my way, so of course. I do have a couple of little last points I want to make.
Oh, yeah.
One of the comments that I hear about larger cubes is that there's a lot of opportunity for novel board states or surprises from the cube designer. Like, oh, I didn't think to put those cards together. Or, wow, you showed me something about the cube that I didn't expect when building it. And I have this theory that nothing is ever accidental when we design these games. As a goal, there's not necessarily this reliance on randomness to create novelty, but there's an understanding that all the uniqueness that you provide, all of the different interactions that you provide, it's very calculated and it all has a purpose. And there's really no such thing as magic. They've discovered something as a player and you've left them with an experience. But come on, if you put the card in your cube, you know that these things are all possible together. Try to think of your cube as a machine where every part has a purpose. Nothing that you see should surprise you, but everything that the player experiences should surprise them. And the last thing I want to say is don't be afraid to protect your players from having a more difficult experience. I think challenging people to find paths to victory and to try to navigate uncertainty, to try to achieve something and to fail or to win, to flourish is really important for player growth, player experience. And the key is not to protect the player from failure or difficulty. The key is to protect your game from being destroyed by the players. If you can find a way, get your players to be stressed out and struggle and find something joyful in that process, even when they're losing, then they're going to come back and they're going to want to play it again. And I think that there's no better compliment that you can receive as somebody who's trying to share experiences with other people than for them to want to go through it all over again, even if they didn't do well. And that's something that I look for above anything else.
Absolutely. The stress and the fun combined.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all players could use a little more stress.
No hand holding here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Figure it out. It's okay. Magic's hard, cube's hard. You're going to figure it out. You're going to have a good time. You know, that's the promise, right? As a cube designer, you want to make sure that people are enjoying their experience. It's not a self-indulgent thing for you to watch people go through. At least that's how I see it.
Watch the players suffer.
Watch the players suffer.
Laughing in
Yeah.
the corner.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Derek. And anything you want to say before we wrap up here?
Oh, thanks for having me on. I feel like I blacked out a couple times during this conversation, so I hope it was all coherent. And I hope I didn't come across as too much of a rambler. I do have a tendency to do that, especially when talking about this stuff. So yeah, I'm
We hit
sorry if I.
some great high level concepts, a lot of different variety. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, good. Great.
And once again, if you happen to be interested, ConnectiCube is going to be happening next year. If you happen to be in the area of Games IRL in Avon, Connecticut, we're always looking for more cubers. And please like, subscribe, follow, all that fun stuff. And we'll see you all soon for more cube action.